I'm going to be pointing out specific sections of this MFA thesis written by Taylor Hayes. Feel free to pause on the screen if you want to read the paragraphs more in depth, but you can also click the link below this video if you want to download the full thesis. Starting with the abstract, remember that the abstract is very artist-focused. This is about you. Some people find it easier to write this part last after seeing how the rest of the thesis takes shape, or you might start with your artist statement and think about ways to expand it. Up next, we have the introduction, and it's typical to start an introduction with sort of a history of you, not just as an artist, but as a person. You'll see Taylor discusses growing up. But then there's also a nice transition where you address the topic of the previous paragraph to transition into the next. So we go from growing up into early art making as a child. And another transition from early art making into current process and practice. You'll see the introduction here really held the reader's hand to guide us from childhood into modern day. And your artistic influences and any research that you do are going to be discussed throughout the thesis, so it's okay to focus on your own journey in the introduction. And now we're into our first major section of the paper, which is architecture, space, and ideology. And you'll notice that these sections are very heavy on research and discussing the work of other artists, so it's important to always frame it and bring it back to your own work and how it relates to your own practice. So as we move on to the major sections, notice how the author frames the discussion of the other artists and authors, always relating back to the artists themselves. You aren't writing an art history report. You're not aiming to educate the reader on these artists. You mention them only to give context, to give the reader a more complete sense of your own work and influences. And you'll also notice in this section there are citations for works about gentrification. You might also consider non-art sources for your thesis. For example, if your work explores trauma, you may reference psychological sources. Now here we are at the end of that section, and again, always bringing it back to the artist's work. This section ends with an in-depth discussion of the two works that were in the final thesis show. You may end up with a separate section of your paper where you discuss the works that you showed in the final show, but it's okay to integrate that discussion within another section as well, like Taylor's done here. On to the next section about collage. And now you could easily write a whole book about the history of collage, so when you are discussing the history of your medium, choose excerpts that speak to you and help the reader understand your work. It's not your job in a thesis to teach someone the entire history of your discipline. You're only choosing to discuss historical elements that help the reader understand your own work. You can also use your analytical skills to analyze works yourself instead of always relying on quotations from critics. Don't be afraid to cite people who disagree with you. You can explain why you disagree and how your work challenges previously held assumptions. And now we're moving on to more abstract sections of the paper where we discuss themes of the work. And again, anytime there's a discussion of your research and other artists' work, be sure you're always connecting it back to your own work and talking about how it relates or influences you. Here we have another more abstract section about negative space, absence, and the void. Consider paragraphs like this, which point the reader's attention to the string connecting various artists that you've just discussed. For example, on the previous page, Taylor discusses 3 different artists and now points out the commonality between them. It's also a good way to bring the conversation back to your own work. And we end with a section that brings those abstract ideas back to the material, where we talk about activating space and casting shadows. And now we've landed at the last section, which is the conclusion. It's a great way to summarize what you've already said in a way that brings the discussion back to your own work. So let's go back up and see what these sections are one more time, just to get an overhead view of the organization of this thesis. The abstract is often what the reader is going to see first. It's going to help them determine whether or not they want to read your full thesis or not. The introduction is a way for you to introduce yourself as a human being and as an artist to the reader. You may have sections that help the reader understand the content or the subject of your work. Another section that discusses your medium, also your materials and process. You have sections discussing more abstract themes of your work. And you may have multiple sections about themes, or you may have multiple sections about process and materials if you're more of a process-based artist. You may also combine the abstract and the physical. For example, discussing installation. You can discuss your influences and what motivates you, but also the details of how you install your work. And finally, your conclusion, drawing it all together.